The plain is silent before the thunder. Not empty. Not peaceful. Silent. A gray dawn hangs low over the grass. Horses stand in restless lines, nostrils steaming, flanks dark with sweat. Men tighten leather straps. Fingers close around bows. Iron whispers against iron. Somewhere behind them, a city still burns. The smoke carries the smell of conquest. Wet ash. Broken timber. Trampled earth. Blood drying into dust. Then the riders begin to move. At first, only a ripple. 1,000 hooves shift. Then 10,000. The ground begins to tremble beneath them, not with fear, but with certainty. They have done this before. They have broken emperors. They have erased cities. They have turned armies into warnings. They had never lost. Not like this. So what stopped them? For generations, that question should have had no answer. The Mongols were not simply an army. They were an event. A storm wearing armor. A force of nature that had learned to think. They came from the endless steppe, where winter punished weakness and distance shaped men into weapons. They could sleep in the saddle, cross rivers in silence, fire arrows at full gallop, and move faster than kingdoms could understand. Under Genghis Khan, scattered tribes became a machine. He did not simply unite the Mongols. He sharpened them into order. Their armies moved with terrifying precision. Scouts rode far ahead. Commands passed through flags, drums, horns, and smoke. They arrived already knowing where the enemy would break. And when the enemy broke, there was no mercy in the pursuit. Cities learned the pattern. First came the envoys. Then the demand. Submit, and live. Resist, and become an example. Some surrendered. Some trusted their walls. Walls did not save them. Across Asia, Persia, the Caucasus, Russia, and beyond, fortresses fell, princes knelt, markets became killing grounds, and armies vanished into dust. Survivors carried the story ahead of the riders, and that was exactly what the Mongols wanted. Fear rode faster than horses. By the time Mongol banners appeared outside a city, the battle had often already begun inside the minds of its defenders. Resistance might not only fail. It might invite annihilation. This was not madness. It was strategy. The Mongols understood terror as logistics. Every city that surrendered saved arrows, horses, men, and time. Every massacre became a message carved into memory. Then came Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother of the great Khan. His mission was not to raid. It was to finish what earlier conquests had begun. He would bring the lands of Islam under Mongol power. And in 1258, he came to Baghdad. Baghdad was not just a city. It was an idea built from brick, water, paper, and faith. For centuries, it had stood as a capital of scholars, merchants, physicians, astronomers, translators, jurists, poets, and theologians. Its libraries carried philosophy, science, mathematics, medicine, law, astronomy, theology, poetry, and history. The city believed knowledge could outlive kings. Then the Mongols surrounded it. The caliph had prestige. Baghdad had walls. The city had history. None of it was enough. Hulagu's forces closed in with siege engines, discipline, and patience. The city that imagined itself central to the world became a trapped animal listening to the machinery of its own destruction. When Baghdad fell, it was broken open. Streets filled with bodies. Palaces were stripped. Scholars died beside soldiers. Families disappeared into smoke. The caliph was captured and executed. A dynasty ended in dust. And then came the books. Manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris. Works copied across generations were cast into the river like refuse. The image survived because it was unbearable. The river running black with ink. Baghdad had been more than defeated. It had been unmade. For those watching from the west, this was apocalypse with a cavalry screen. If Baghdad could fall, what city was safe? If the caliph could be killed, what crown mattered? If libraries could be drowned, what could civilization do against men who rode like judgment? The answer seemed obvious. Nothing. So when Hulagu's army turned west after Baghdad, the world trembled. Ahead lay Syria. Beyond Syria, Egypt. And in Egypt, the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mongols moved through the Levant beneath the shadow of their own reputation. Cities weighed honor against survival. Letters arrived demanding submission, and behind every line stood the same threat. Kneel, or be erased. Aleppo fell. Damascus submitted. Rulers fled. Fortresses opened their gates. The Mongols were coming. Egypt would be next. The terror was not irrational. It was educated. People had seen what happened to those who misjudged Mongol patience. They had heard of cities reduced to silence. They had watched refugees move south with hollow eyes and smoke still clinging to their clothes. Every road became a rumor. Every rider on the horizon became a warning. And every council chamber held the same question. Who could stand? Then something changed. Not in the Mongol camp. In Egypt. The Mamluks were not soft princes inheriting armies they had never bled beside. They were a military caste forged through captivity, discipline, and violence. Many had been bought as boys from Turkic and Circassian lands, from harsh northern worlds that also knew horses, bows, raids, cold, and survival. They were slaves in law, but soldiers in reality. Trained from youth. Hardened in barracks. Raised to ride, shoot, endure, obey, and command. They were outsiders transformed into guardians. That contradiction made them dangerous. The settled world feared the steppe because it did not understand it. The Mamluks understood it. They knew mounted warfare not as theory, but as instinct. They knew the bow from horseback, the charge, the withdrawal, the lure, the sudden turn, the trap. The Mongols were about to meet an enemy who did not look at them like a miracle. The Mamluks saw men. Deadly men. Brilliant men. But men. At the center of the response stood Sultan Qutuz and Baybars, a commander of fierce intelligence and step-born instinct. Baghdad was gone. Syria had fallen. If the Mongols crossed into Egypt, the last great military power of the Islamic heartlands might be crushed. So the Mamluks did something extraordinary. They advanced. Not away from the storm. Toward it. They crossed into Palestine to meet the Mongols before Egypt became the battlefield. They understood that the Mongol advantage was movement, fear, and momentum. Let the Mongols choose the place, and they would arrive as conquerors. Force them into chosen ground, and perhaps the legend could be touched. Perhaps it could bleed. By then, Hulagu himself had withdrawn east with much of his main force, called away by imperial politics. What remained in Syria was still dangerous, a Mongol army under Kitbuka, a veteran commander confident in the system that had carried Mongol banners across continents. Kitbuka was not a fool. He knew the old rhythm. Advance. Strike. Scatter. Pursue. Destroy. He had every reason to believe the men approaching from Egypt would become another broken enemy. Then the two forces drew near a place whose name means the spring of Goliath. Ain Jalut. The land was broken by hills, valleys, groves, and folds of earth. Places where men could vanish. Places where patience could wait with a blade in its hand. The Mamluks understood this. They did not show all their strength at once. Baybars moved forward with an advance force, the visible bait, while Qutuz kept the main Mamluk body hidden among the surrounding terrain. The trap was not complex. It was older than empire. Let pride see what it wants to see. Mamluk horsemen appeared before the Mongols, close enough to threaten, not close enough to be swallowed. Arrows rose. Hooves struck. Dust lifted from the field. The Mongols answered with confidence. They knew this game. They had turned retreat into art. A retreating cavalry force is not always fleeing. Sometimes it is pulling a hook through flesh. Kitbuka saw the Mamluks give ground. The line bent. Then fell back. The Mongols pressed. Their horses surged forward. Bows bent. Men shouted over the thunder of hooves. The battlefield began to move in one direction, away from Mongol pressure, away from Mongol certainty. Baybars retreated. Not in panic. In design. He gave the Mongols what they expected. He let them taste pursuit. He let them believe the old pattern was working again. That was the beauty of the trap. It wore the face of a familiar victory. The Mongols chased. Faster. Deeper. The ground narrowed around them. Hidden Mamluk forces waited. Spears were lowered. Bows were ready. Horses trembled beneath riders holding their breath. For one moment, history balanced on silence. Then the jaws closed. Mamluk forces erupted from concealment. From the sides. From the folds of the land. From the places the Mongols did not own. What had seemed like pursuit became enclosure. What had seemed like weakness became intention. The Mongols were no longer driving the battle. They were inside it. Kitbuka understood all at once. The retreat had been false. The enemy had not broken. The enemy had invited him forward. The tactic that had carried Mongol armies to triumph had been turned back upon them. Now the air was full of arrows. Men twisted in saddles. Horses screamed. Dust became a wall. Commands disappeared beneath impact and shouting. The Mamluks struck hard, like cavalrymen who knew when a mounted army was most vulnerable, when pursuit had stretched it, when confidence had narrowed its vision, when momentum had become exposure. Kitbuka rallied his men. Of course he did. The Mongols did not dissolve at the first blow. Their discipline was real. Their courage was real. They wheeled. They counterattacked. They slammed into the Mamluk lines. For a time, the battle became uncertain again. Horse. Steel. Dust. Will. The Mongols pushed. The Mamluk line strained. There was a moment when the trap itself seemed in danger of breaking. Perhaps even this was not enough. Can they actually be stopped? Qutuz saw the danger. He threw himself into the moment. The Sultan, the man whose kingdom stood behind him, rallied his troops with the urgency of a world that could not afford a second Baghdad. Tradition remembers him casting aside his helmet, exposing himself to his men, crying out for the line to hold. Whether every word reached every ear is not the point. The meaning reached them. Hold. The Mamluks held. Then they pressed. The pressure changed. The Mongol attack began to lose its shape. A charge is not merely men moving forward. It is belief given speed. It must believe the enemy will yield. At Ain Jalut, that belief began to fracture. First, a hesitation. A horse pulled too sharply. A rider looking for space that was no longer there. A unit turning not to pursue, but to survive. Then the hesitation spread. The Mongol charge faltered. Then stopped. Then reversed. For the Mamluks, the impossible became visible. The Mongols were falling back. Not maneuvering. Not feigning. Falling back. Imagine what that did to men who had spent their lives hearing that the Mongols were fate. Imagine the first Mamluk rider who saw a Mongol line bend under pressure and realized that the stories were not laws of nature. They were stories. Deadly stories. But still stories. For the Mongols, the shock was deeper than tactical failure. This was open battle. Cavalry against cavalry. Skill against skill. Will against will. And the world's most feared war machine was being forced backward. Kitbuka refused surrender. He fought on, the center of a collapsing storm. Around him, men died in the dust. Horses bolted riderless. Standards vanished into violence. Kitbuka was captured. Then killed. A Mongol army had been defeated in the field. Not avoided. Not delayed. Defeated. A spell had broken. The Mamluks did not merely win a battle. They injured an idea. For decades, the Mongols had carried an aura greater than their numbers, greater even than their victories. They had seemed inevitable. Armies planned around their own defeat. Cities surrendered to men they had not yet fought. At Ain Jalut, inevitability died. Not everywhere. Not forever. The Mongol Empire remained vast. Its armies remained terrifying. No single battle could erase such power. But something irreversible happened. The westward Mongol advance into the heart of the Middle East was stopped. Egypt survived. The Mamluk Sultanate survived. The Islamic world, wounded by Baghdad, did not collapse into silence. The Mongols would return. But the door that had seemed ready to burst open into Egypt did not open. Ain Jalut became the hinge. Its meaning is not only that the Mongols lost. The deeper meaning is how they lost. The Mamluks did not defeat them by hiding behind walls until the storm passed. They met the Mongols in the language the Mongols understood best: mobility, deception, discipline, mounted warfare, and psychological pressure. They beat them by understanding them. They used the rhythm of steppe war against masters of the steppe. The feigned retreat. The lure. The ambush. The sudden encirclement. At Ain Jalut, the grammar of Mongol victory was spoken back to them with a different accent and a sharper blade. That is why the battle endures. Not because it destroyed the Mongol Empire. It did not. Not because it ended Mongol power. It did not. It endures because it revealed that even the greatest military system on earth had limits when confronted by an enemy disciplined enough to learn from it, brave enough to face it, and ruthless enough to use its own methods without flinching. The myth had been useful to the Mongols. Then the myth became dangerous. At Ain Jalut, the Mongols saw what so many of their enemies had seen before them. A retreating enemy. An opening. A chase. A promise. Then the earth closed. The empire that had terrified kingdoms was stopped by men who had once been bought and sold. Men taken from the margins of power and remade into its defenders. Men whose childhoods had been stolen by war, who then mastered that war so completely they could turn it against the most feared conquerors alive. They were not freeborn kings defending inherited thrones. They were soldiers forged by loss. Survival was not granted by bloodline, title, or the age of a city's walls. Survival had to be learned, practiced, paid for. Again and again. The Mongols had taught half the world that fear could win battles before arrows were loosed. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks answered with a harder lesson. Fear can be studied. Fear can be endured. Fear can be used. When the smoke cleared from that field in 1260, the world was not suddenly safe. Baghdad was still ruined. The Mongol Empire still stretched across the horizon like a shadow too large for any one age. But somewhere inside that shadow, there was now a crack. A place where the light entered. The writers who had seemed like the end of history had met men who refused to let history end there. Even thunder stops when it meets a mountain that will not move.